Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Open Democracy live discussion on Thursdays. My name is Tom Rowley. I'm the lead editor of Open Democracy's section on the post-Soviet space, ODR. And yeah, welcome. We have two fantastic speakers for you tonight, Ilya Matveev and Ben Noble, who I'll give some more introduction on in a second. But first off, I just wanted to say we want this conversation to involve you as much as possible. And particular thanks to all those who submitted questions and comments ahead of time. We're going to address as many of them as we can. Please also put your questions in the chat box when you're ready. You can click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type into the chat window. People watching on Facebook or elsewhere should be able to put their questions in the comments, and we'll get to them when we can. And yet the theme of tonight's live discussion is the Russian parliamentary elections. And many of you may have noticed some of the news last week about Apple and Google being blocked in Russia regarding the smart voting program. Over the weekend, we obviously, and particularly after the closure of voting, we saw potentially serious reports of violations, particularly on electronic voting. But beyond these perhaps technical but increasingly important moments, it's also a key time for Russian society and the Russian political regime itself, and that's what our participants will be talking about tonight. You may have noticed there have been a few changes when it comes to our panelists, unfortunately due to certain events which are definitely outside of our control. Unfortunately, Alexandra Zapolskaya and Mikhail Lobanov won't be joining us tonight, but we do have Dr. Ben Noble and Dr. Ilya Matveev with us, who I'm absolutely delighted to have them here. Ben is a lecturer in Russian politics at University College London and an associate fellow of Chatham House. Most importantly, he has a new book out about Alexei Navalny called Navalny, Putin's Nemesis, Russia's Future, which was co-authored with Morvin Lalue and Jan Matti Dolban. And Ilya Matveev is a researcher and lecturer, founder of openleft.ru, a Russian left-wing resource, and also a member of Public Sociology Laboratory, which is an autonomous research initiative led by Russian sociologists. So yeah, to get started off, I'm going to say a few words about the election, and then we're going to go to our panelists. And I think it's fair to say that expectations for these elections were both high and low simultaneously. They were low in the sense that, you know, since the repression campaign against independent candidates and activists across the country, not least all against those affiliated with Alexei Navalny, and of course the Russian constitution referendum in 2020, it seems that the Russian authorities are less interested in extending the limited space that already exists for legislative politics in the country. By contrast, you have an upswing in protest politics in the country. And if you follow the independent campaigns, some of them are very exciting. We profiled the campaign by Mikhail Lobanov, mathematics lecturer and Democratic Socialist candidate running in Moscow against a state television host, which you can read about. I think there should be a link in the chat. So it's clear that there's still a lot going on. And then zooming further out, we have the fate, in more ways than one, of opposition politician Navalny, who has become this kind of contester-in-chief who brings issues around power, democracy, legitimacy, social equality into question in the country. And I know that Ben and both Ilya have thought deeply about this, and Ben, of course, with his new book, Alexei Navalny, Putin's Nemesis, Russia's Future. So I'd like to go straight to Ben, actually, just to start us off with some context for these elections. What should our viewers know in the kind of the short version about this contest, just to set the scene?
Thanks, Tom, and thanks for the invitation to take part in this event. The broad context, you mentioned that we're focusing on the parliamentary elections, therefore the State Duma, which is the lower chamber of the national parliament in Russia, but we shouldn't forget that voting took place on Friday, Saturday and Sunday across all levels of the federation in Russia. So it wasn't just to the State Duma, but also at the regional level and local levels for both executive and legislative posts. But I think everybody watching will know the result, that United Russia claims to have resecured a constitutional majority. So they've got 324 seats in the 8th convocation of the State Duma, which is going to sit until, well, at least it's scheduled to sit until 2026. And that's one indication of the importance of these elections, that will run across the 2024 presidential election. And it's clear that the Kremlin wanted to resecure a constitutional majority, albeit having to resort to take unprecedented steps in order to achieve that. And I'll mention a few of those in a bit, but they wanted to do that so that they retain dominance over the Duma, both so that they could dominate the lawmaking agenda and pass constitutional changes if they wanted to without relying on other parties, but also symbolically to say we're still in charge, we're still dominating, and maybe to increase the sense of hopelessness in some sections of the opposition. Even though the official results are still yet formally to be announced, I think I'm correct in saying that. The analysis that has taken place so far points to widespread falsification. So according to some estimates, for up to 14 million votes cast for United Russia have been done so fraudulently. And that has led to statements condemning these results from various quarters. But, we saw on social media lots of videos of ballot stuffing, the traditional things that we're used to seeing, but we shouldn't forget the things that took place before the election days themselves, part of this broader menu of manipulation that unleveled the electoral playing field. And that includes things like the imprisonment of Alexei Navalny, the destruction of his movement, blocking certain opposition candidates from running, the negative PR campaigns ran against certain opposition forces, including the Communist Party, as well as the running of things like spoiler parties and spoiler candidates. So there's some of the things that we might think of as being negative things, attacks, but then there are also positive things, the carrots that were being offered by the Kremlin. So these one-off pre-election payments made to pensioners, members of the military, law enforcement, which is clearly a way for the Kremlin to try and court the opposition, the support base for the sitting political leadership. We also saw workplace mobilization. So early on Friday, we saw very, very long queues to polling stations, and it seems to be that they're reporting that lots of these people had been pressured to turn out to vote, the implication being that they would turn out to vote for United Russia. So that's the sort of the lead-in that has been taking place for a while, and it's clear that the Kremlin has taken unprecedented steps given the importance of these elections, because if they lost control over the State Duma, or even if they lost the supermajority, that would be regarded by them, and they fear the Russian population, as a sign of a loss of control. And as I've mentioned, one of the reasons why it's so important is because of the 2024 presidential elections coming up. So that's sort of some of the more broader context for this discussion, I hope.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ben. I think that's a really wonderful setting up of some of the problems or issues that we're going to be dealing with here. I actually just wanted to bring in Ilya immediately and just ask a question which is kind of comes into Ben's overview there, which is fantastic, which is in terms of this, not only the negative menu, but the kind of this broader range of mobilizing around the elections. Have you noticed anything new in terms of the measures the authorities have appeared to be taking?
So I would like to thank Ben for the introduction, and he's done most of the work for me, in fact. And I also would like to for my friends the staff of Mikhail Lobanov, who were supposed to now protesting against the results of the election that were in fact fraudulent. So they're already busy doing activism. So you're stuck with armchair social scientists such as Ben and me. Maybe not Ben, I don't know, but me for sure. And,
no, I agree. You're stuck with social scientists boring us.
Yeah. But my other excuse is that I'm based in Petersburg and the campaign has taken place in Moscow. So I did what I could on the distance, but most of the action was happening in Moscow, in fact. And I would say that the biggest change in this election is the scale of electoral fraud. And we already have some statistical investigations that demonstrate that the actual result of United Russia decreased around 10% from 40% to 30%. And I'm talking about the real results, not the fraudulent results, but the real results. So the real results decreased 10%. And the results of the Communist Party consequently increased 10, maybe even 15% from the previous election. And this signifies loss of popularity for the regime, loss of popularity for United Russia in particular. So this party was never extremely popular. It depended fully on Vladimir Putin, his own personal popularity. But now we see that United Russia is in deep crisis, right? And the end result of the elections, so the number of seats in the parliament for United Russia is not that different from 5 years ago. So it's only down some 20, maybe 19 seats. So it's almost the same. It's also the constitutional majority, like Ben said, right? So, but nevertheless, the support declined dramatically, right? And because of this, they needed absolutely dramatic measures of, as they say, correcting, they use this term, correcting results of election. And so the scale was unprecedented. I mean, we saw unprecedented fraud during the vote for the constitutional amendments 1 year ago, and we see the same scale and let's say ferocity of electoral frauds in these elections as well, right? So in particular, this was truly shocking to me. Sorry.
Yeah, could I just come in there and ask
the connection?
As well. Sorry, can I just come in? Could you just give our audience a flavour of some of the evidence, whether direct or circumstantial, that's pointing to this electoral kind of violations? If you could just a few points so people have an idea of what this prospect is based on. Thank you.
Right. So direct evidence is the video and photo evidence of ballot stuffing, of protocols from the local electoral commissions, the numbers not adding up to the final result from this particular district entered into the system of voting. So the end result is different from what electoral observers could register, and they took photos of the protocols, and the numbers are different from what we have in the official results. So that's the first direct evidence, and also very simple evidence of ballot stuffing. So the craziest video that I saw from this election was the member of the Electoral Commission is just putting ballots into the box, just like this. But a curious thing was that she was being filmed by a policeman. For some reason, this particular policeman, actually a mayor of police, it's actually a very serious officer, police officer, right? So he was filming her, and he was saying, so do you understand that I'm a police officer and you're just committing a crime right in front of my eyes? I'm also filming you, and also I'm calling, like the police reinforcements in order to take you to jail. So he's just saying to her that you understand, right, that you're committing a crime right here and right now. And she's like, do what you need to do, but I'm doing what I need to do. And she's just continuing to put these ballots. It's just incredible. It's not an observer, so it's not an activist, it's a police officer. So when I saw this, I was just wondering what kind of system needs to be created where this kind of behavior is actually possible. Like, what kind of system? How do they do this? How do they create motivation in these people to disobey police orders in order to continue falsifying the election, right? So to me, this was the starkest example of electoral fraud. And emotionally speaking, it was even more powerful than the so-called electronic voting that was completely falsified in Moscow. Because electronic voting, it's something abstract. It's just manipulation of numbers. But when you see policemen ordering a person to stop, and this person says, "No, I'm not going to stop. I'm going to do this." So this is really something crazy.
I think Ben was going to come in here. I think I've got a follow-up question, but Ben.
Yeah, well, I was just going to add, Tom, that what Ilya said about the emotion of it, that it's easier to connect emotionally and be outraged at footage like that. Whereas, as Ilya said, online voting is more abstract and it sort of happens away from you. You're not going to have these outrageous videos that are going to be circulated on social media. And it seems like online voting is going to be used increasingly with the prospect that for the 2024 presidential election, it's possible for all voters across the country. And so we're not going to have these videos, these direct bits of evidence, which is going to make it trickier for people to answer the question that you asked, Tom, which is where's the direct evidence? If it's all taking place in a computer, it's trickier for somebody to say, well, look, here you see ballot stuffing. And that's a clear worry. And it's one of the reasons why we've seen people talk about the idea that these are the last elections where civil society could make a difference. So I just thought I'd jump in there because it's, Ilya raised a point talking about the emotional connection I think is really important to stress when it comes to the question about electoral technology and whether it makes a difference. Yes, it can, including the opportunities for citizen oversight at the moment during the elections themselves and not just afterwards. Because with online voting, yes, you can carry out election forensics to work out whether there's evidence of falsification, but you don't have that emotional connection of people looking at ballots being stuffed.
I think that's a really important point, and actually it comes to a kind of contextual point, which is we come back 10 years to the 2011 parliamentary elections, and those video and photographic evidence of vote falsification and vote and ballot stuffing, has been thought to be one of the main triggers of that cycle of protest, which I know, Ilya, in particular, you have studied. And actually, just on that point, I think I read today that one of the independent candidates in Moscow, I think, has already called for a campaign against electronic voting as a whole. I mean, participants may be able to correct me on that one, but it seems that now this e-voting is going to start attracting more attention as a target of campaigning and so on, which I think is going to be very interesting because, I mean, obviously we see around the world this move to e-voting as being a kind of shift towards more open, transparent, of course, digital government. But here, obviously, it's in the hands of slightly different, shall we say, slightly different authorities. I think that's a really good point, actually. We've just gone back to 2011, which maybe some of our readers know was this pretty contested election that then gave way to the president election and this kind of whole cycle of contest. I wonder if that was one of the first periods when I started really paying attention to what was going on in Russia. So personal anecdotes aside, I wonder, is that moment still relevant for Russian politics, or has that moment since disappeared? That kind of 2011 to 2013 Bolotnaya, so-called Bolotnaya cycle, named after Bolotnaya Square in Moscow, where many of the Moscow protesters and indeed protesters coming from outside of Moscow gathered during that time. Please, Ilya.
So I can start perhaps, and I would say that this moment is definitely still relevant because the protests 10 years ago, they demonstrated the link between the electoral process and street politics, right, in this authoritarian context. So they demonstrated that there is a connection between elections. Even if elections themselves are fraudulent, still there is a connection between people going and voting and people protesting, right? So there can be a certain political momentum when you have some kind of electoral campaign, and this campaign transforms into a street campaign, a campaign of street protests. And Navalny, for instance, understands it very well, and his whole idea of the strategic voting, which he calls smart voting, is based on this understanding that it's not just about electing people to the parliament, it's also about bringing the momentum from elections to street politics, right? But there is a huge difference. So the regime changed in Russia, and street protests are basically impossible right now. So that's the biggest difference from 2 years ago. And street protests are crushed. They're crushed with relent or anything like this. And so that's the biggest difference. And this is why there are no huge demonstrations now, even though in Moscow they tried to do something. But the main reason for the lack of street activity is that we saw what happens when people protest in January this year, when Navalny went back to Russia and this Putin's palace video was published, right? So we saw what happens when people protest, and these protests were just brutally dispersed by police, and hundreds of people were sent to jail. So this is like a dead end, right? So we see that the street protests are put on hold for a moment. So there is still a connection, but this connection is sort of put on hold, let's say.
That's a wonderful point. I think, Ben, you're going to come in here on this kind of after effects of Bolotnaya, etc.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, Ilya has put it so well, and it raises the question of put on hold for how long, and what methods are the authorities going to have to use to put it on hold. And I think going forward, any sense that would be a post-election thaw, that the Kremlin would say, okay, we've got our supermajority, now we can relax a bit. Absolute nonsense. I think if anything, the level of repression is going to increase for a number of reasons. One of them is that there is now the general narrative that if you're independent media, or if you're politically in the opposition, the real opposition, you have been equated in the authorities' mind and in their narrative as a traitor, as some type of agent in the West. And it's really tricky to change that type of narrative, at least quickly. The other thing is that there are certainly people within the Kremlin who favor a more repressive, coercive approach rather than the sort of softer managed democracy type of approach. And it's difficult to see that their power is going to wane. People like Patrushev, I can't imagine, are going to loosen the repressive methods being used. But also there's a certain inertia there. Now you have the whole law enforcement apparatus realizing this is their opportunity to be active and to be visible and to be involved. So now I'm not talking about the people at the elite, just more broadly, organizationally, there's an inertia there. And so it's difficult to come up with a positive scenario for whether the level of repression is going to change for the better going forward. I think if anything, it's going to increase. And just as a mode of governance, it's not as if the Kremlin has projected a positive image where the country is going. And in that situation, repression needs to be relied upon. But also there are other factors. People might now, to a degree, be inured by looking at ballot stuffing. They might just now say, well, it's going to happen, but there aren't going to be consequences. Or they might look at investigations like Putin's palace and say, well, corruption is taking place, but these people haven't been held to account. And so the Kremlin can rely on people being despondent, apathetic. But there's one area where the Kremlin is really worried, and that's rising prices. And if prices are to go up, and it seems as though the Kremlin can do certain things to stop prices going up. And we saw that in the lead up to the election. So the government would tell companies, keep prices down, otherwise there are going to be negative consequences. But they can only do that for so long. So if prices were to rise, then I think the authorities would have to rely on repression to keep dissent, criticism and protest at bay. So I'm afraid that's a bit of a bleak picture, but I think that's the realistic view at the moment.
I think thanks so much, Ben. Ilya, before you come in, if I could just slightly reorient the conversation, which is Ben in particular mentioned this word inertia. And I think there is a sense of, critics often point to a sense of frustration, inertia around kind of living in Russia, particularly on the socioeconomic front, as well as obviously with regards to chances for democratic politics. I wanted just to come round back to Alexei Navalny, because Ben, you've now written the book on Alexei Navalny. Ilya has thought a lot about, I know Ilya has thought a lot about Navalny as well, both in terms of his social science work and also, of course, as someone with a left-wing agenda, I think it's fair to say. Could you say a couple of words about Navalny's role prior to his arrest and what was going on before that? And then we can kind of come back to this kind of post-arrest situation.
Sure, thanks, Tom. I should hold up a copy of the book. This is the front cover of the book. My co-authors are Jan-Matti Dolbam and Morvan Lalouette. We wrote the book really quickly because we were asked by so many people, especially when Navalny returned to Russia in January this year, who is he? How do we make sense of him? Lots of the coverage of him in the West was really, really bad. It was very black and white. It was saying Navalny is this white knight who's returning to the evil Putin. And that was sort of the media frame, which fits into a longer tradition of coverage in the West of Russia, which is very Manichaean, quite simplistic narrative. And so when Amnesty International labeled him a prisoner of conscience, but then took it back because of his past statements and then put the label back on, that intensifies confusion with people trying to make sense of who Navalny is, what his place more broadly in Russia is. So that's why we wrote the book. But maybe to make what I'm going to say relevant to this event on the elections, it's interesting that Navalny's position on how to approach elections has changed quite markedly over time. So sometimes he has called for people to boycott elections, saying, look, these are sham institutions, don't take part in them, you're not going to be able to make a difference. If you do take part in them, then in a sense you're lending legitimacy to this facade. Then he's backed another approach saying, no, do take part, but vote for any party other than United Russia. Smart voting is a slightly finessed version of that, saying we are going to recommend to you members of the opposition who might be split across different parties, might have wildly different policy preferences, ideological positions, but you're all united in wanting to bring down the current system. We're going to select the candidate that we think is best positioned to take on United Russia. And if you vote for that person, you might disagree with them, but real politics and voting for your candidate can wait until we've been able to bring down the current political system. That's the thinking. I don't think smart voting going into these elections is meant to deprive United Russia of a supermajority. I don't think they thought that it was going to be that have that much of a shocking defeat. It's much more about smaller scale victories, especially at the regional and local level. And research done by Mikhail Turchenko and Grigory Golosov shows that smart voting can make a difference if people follow the indications of Team Navalny. But these differences aren't huge. And that points to maybe the broader significance of smart voting, and that's trying to tell the opposition that in these really difficult circumstances, don't just become politically apathetic. You can be involved in the system in a way that makes a difference. And the early results seem to suggest, especially looking at, say, the opposition candidates in Moscow, that smart voting can make a difference. It can actually do something to get over the collective action problem that has bedeviled opposition political groups in Russia for a very long time. And not just only in Russia, you see this in many different political settings. The problem is, though, that the authorities can respond and say, you can do all the smart voting you want, but we can intervene and fix the figures. We can add the online voting results that snatched away what seemed like early on with the preliminary results, victories for the opposition. And so my worry, and maybe Ilya has a more positive spin on this, maybe he doesn't. My worry is that this broader goal that smart voting would convince people not to be so politically apathetic, to convince them that taking part can actually make a difference. It's difficult to see how that's going to work. We've seen today, Leonid Volkov put out a video making it clear that smart voting can work, but the figures have been fixed. But it's not as if it's going to have that feel-good feeling that would sweep across the opposition saying, look, this is the future, this is what we should stick to in order to carry on with the elections. So it's definitely a mixed picture. We already know that some people didn't buy into the smart voting project anyway, because lots of members of the opposition don't like being told that you should vote for somebody with whom you don't agree ideologically. The idea of liberals voting for KPRF candidates, that was just too much for some people. So we know there has been certain resistance. We also know that we should be cautious in saying that smart voting has been successful. The Communist Party, its approval ratings were rising for a couple of months before the elections. And of course, that could be in part due to the fact that certain candidates were being blocked from running the elections. And so voters were turning from those candidates to the Communist Party as maybe a party that they would back, but without following smart voting. So, as social scientists, we should be really cautious and do the type of work that Turchenko and Golosov have done, but it takes a bit of time to work out the difference that is made. But if we're thinking about meaningfulness on the ground to activists and people involved in opposition politics in Russia, I fear that, hopelessness and despondency is only going to increase. But that's my very negative message at the moment. Sorry.
Thank you. Ilya, I'm not sure if you want to respond on that point, but just before you do, I just want to make sure to our listeners and viewers, please put your questions in the chat. We are definitely coming up to wanting to try and answer some of them. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. I noticed there's one there which we're going to come to right after Ilya responds. Thank you.
Right. So I would just add a few points about Navalny's electoral strategy. So sometimes it seems there is a certain logic to it, right? So it's just a different approach to, let's say, presidential elections and local elections or parliamentary elections. And the logic here is that presidential elections, or for instance, last year's election, the votes on constitutional amendments. So they have this aura of a plebiscite, right? So it's a yes-no election, let's say. And in the context of a yes-no election, in which the whole power of the state will be oriented towards producing this like glorious victory for the leader, let's say, right? So it's useless to take part in such a campaign, and it's useless to take part in this election because it's very close to a Soviet type election where you just need to produce 99.9% majority for a specific candidate, right? But at the same time, local elections and parliamentary elections are different because this is not a plebiscite. It's more like a different situation in different places, right? Also different scale of fraud. So this is what Volkov always says. He says that the results for the proportional part of the elections, right, for the Duma, for the parliament, they are less important than results in single-member districts because the results for the party list election, they will be skewed towards places like Chechnya, where United Russia gets 99%. So in general, it doesn't really, it's not even important what kind of results did United Russia get on the party list, because these results are influenced by those electoral, they call them electoral sultanates in Russia, right? So sultanate in the sense that it's a place where it's just 99% for the authorities, right? So party list elections are going to be skewed towards this result, but local elections, they could produce different results. And so it makes sense to vote in local elections, but it doesn't make sense to vote in presidential election, for instance. I mean, if you think like Navalny, so there is a logic to this. It's not like a random thing, but at the same time, a lot of people, and maybe even the majority of people, unfortunately, do not see this logic. And they say, look, Navalny changed his position. He said, don't vote. Now he says, go and vote. So how do you explain this, right? And I saw this type of reaction, and it's totally justified. And previously, Navalny spent a lot of time on sort of political education. So what he was doing was educating people on his political logic. So he was trying to explain it, like to explicate why it makes sense to vote now, why does it make sense to vote in a different situation. So he was going on and on and on and on and on. It was like a lesson, I would say. But unfortunately, Navalny is now in prison, and so the lessons stopped. And what I saw was that for a lot of people, there was a very quick process of regression to their previous opinions that were less enlightened because this constant education by Navalny stopped. So in that respect, I actually I very much respect what he was doing in terms of like educating people, like what kind of electoral strategies make sense, right? And in general, I would say that smart voting is such a leap forward. And it's such a complex strategy that nevertheless became so prominent. And Volkov says that there are about 400, maybe 500,000 people in Moscow who used smart voting in this particular election. So 500,000 people. And I think it's realistic. And if you think about it, this is a huge achievement because this is not obvious. The strategy is not obvious. The obvious strategy is to vote for the guy you like. And mostly these are guys from Yabloko, for instance, from Yabloko party, which is a small party, which is nevertheless very popular with the intelligentsia. in Russia, right? So this is the obvious strategy. But this kind of strategic voting, advanced strategic voting, is actually not obvious. And still a lot of people used it, understanding full well what they were doing, that this is a strategic vote. It's not, let's say, expressing your true preference. It's expressing your second level preference, just United Russia out, someone else in. So I think that this is a huge achievement for Navalny and for his electoral strategy. Also, I do have some kind of optimistic prediction. So Ben said that his views are pessimistic. Of course, I mean, the situation does not create optimism, to say the least, right? But at the same time, what I see is that in Moscow, smart voting won, simply put, right? So Navalny's strategy succeeded in Moscow 100%. So I think that probably all of his candidates that he put forward in the smart voting campaign, all of those candidates won the elections. The objective results are that all of them won, right? So the final results, the official results, were that all of them lost, but the real results are that all of them won, maybe except 1, 2, 3 people. So this created a huge momentum. And I think we already mentioned that some of those candidates who lost, according to the official results, they joined together, and now they have this opposition platform where they try to defend the results of the election together. And this is a very powerful alliance, in my opinion. At least on the city level, the alliance of those candidates who lost the election, but nevertheless received the actual majority of the votes. And they understand that they have the full support of hundreds of thousands of people. And so this is not the end. So this is not the finale of this story.
I think that's a positive moment which will segue us into the question, because there's a couple of questions in the chat which I want to come on to, but that's a really important point that Ilya has made, and it's going to be very interesting to kind of observe both in the next couple of days and weeks, but also the next few months, what these events, particularly in Moscow, are going to mean for some kind of consolidation or alliance of both kind of leading protest activists and protest politicians, and indeed kind of politicians at the local level who are on the kind of opposition end of things. In terms of a couple of questions, I wonder, we have two that I'm kind of divided between, because one takes us in a slightly different direction and one kind of stays on this topic. So maybe we will deal with one that kind of stays on this topic because it's important, which is from Galina Silivanova. And it's a question to both speakers. Ben, I wonder if actually you might respond to this quickly, which is, how do you estimate protest mobilization potential in Russia? Which is a broadly put question, but a good one. I wonder if you might just respond briefly to that.
Are you asking methodologically, or are you asking what's my take at the moment, with my finger on the pulse, whether we're likely to see protest? If it's the latter,
I think what's your take would be brilliant.
Yeah, if it's the latter, then I'm afraid my bleak message is going to continue. We saw the communists call for protests in Moscow. Only 200 people turned up. But as Ilya has said, there are so many steps that have been taken by the authorities to stop street protests being a thing, whether it be coronavirus restrictions, whether it be the authorities and their willingness to allow to sanction rallies. And of course, there have been, and there always will be, people willing to break the rules in order to exercise their right to freedom of assembly. However, given the very visible ways with which people who turned out to protest earlier this year, the visible ways in which they were oppressed, especially in Moscow, but also St. Petersburg and across the country, people are scared, and rightly so. So I think I would like to be proven wrong, I suppose, insofar as I'm keen for people to be able to express their freedom of assembly, their right to assemble freely. But I'm not expecting to see lots of protests going forward. But I'd be fascinated to hear if Ilya thinks differently.
No, I actually agree. I don't think that there's going to be very strong protests, because this tactic was tried by the opposition activists before. So in January, like I said, and the results were very clear that it is simply impossible right now to have a peaceful protest protest of any kind that will not be dispersed in the most brutal way possible, right? So in that sense, I'm not optimistic either. But we cannot ignore the fact that there are a lot of people who are frustrated with the situation, and it's just a simple objective fact that the popularity of the regime has declined, and the actual real vote for United Russia has declined 10%, like I said, right? And especially in the capitals, in Moscow and Petersburg, it's very clear that the majority of people do not support the regime. So this was revealed in a stark fashion in this election, that in Moscow and in Petersburg, people do not like what's going on. So how this will express itself in the future, that is the question. I don't really know, but I think that there might be some ways to express this. There might be some campaigns, some, I don't know, and I'm sure everything is going to be legal and peaceful. So just a small sort of remark on Navalny that I wanted to make for a long time. So to me, it is so striking that he was stripped from the status of prisoner of conscience, right? So I know that it's not the current story, it's slightly old, but still, so he was stripped from the status of the prisoner of conscience by Amnesty International, and he was given the status of simply political prisoner, right? But in fact, the definition of the prisoner of conscience is the person who always adheres to peaceful legal methods of protest, so completely rejects violence. And this is what Navalny did all the time. And at every opportunity, he said that he rejects violence. He rejects, let's say, sort of illegal, violent means of protesting and seizing power using violence. So he was very explicit about this. And in that sense, he perfectly fits into this definition of prisoner of conscience, unlike, for instance, Nelson Mandela, right? Who actually was stripped of this status precisely because he supported like violent activities. And actually, I'm not saying that Mandela was a bad guy. I'm just saying that with Mandela, there is some logic to this, but with Navalny, there is zero logic to this, right? So because Navalny actually supports this peaceful strategy, right? But this peaceful strategy is in crisis because there are no sort of opportunities to express your disagreements in a peaceful way.
And he's just, sorry, Tom, I hope you don't mind me jumping in there, but he's, Navalny has repeated this call for people to protest, but explicitly in, a message that came out today saying peaceful. And so Amnesty International, the reason why it stripped the label at the beginning of this year was going back to statements that Navalny made in the mid-2000s, and that certainly became part of lots of the messaging around Navalny, especially with state-aligned media in Russia and English language state-aligned media. So, I mean, RT was painting Navalny as this ultra-nationalist figure, and there was a sense that there was an information campaign that might have affected Amnesty International's thinking about this point. One of the reasons why we wrote the book was to make sense of what he said in 2007, especially the videos that he made with the Narod movement, that are ugly, that Navalny has not apologized for. But we wanted to put that in historical context. We wanted to make it clear whether he's making those types of statements now. But Ilya's point about peacefulness is something that's really important, because I think some people in Russia, members of the opposition, would want Navalny to call for revolutionary change. But Navalny has been consistent in saying no. He's not. There are younger people who have been pushing for that, but no, Navalny is, at the moment at least, pushing for the peaceful option.
I want to come back to a question from the chat. I think that's a useful point, Ben. Thank you so much for that. I want to come to a question here, which is, I'm just going to cut it down a little bit. Apologies to the person who asked it, which is Gorbachev emerged from a party system. Can a reformer emerge from the Russia's current ruling class / government? I wonder if anyone has a brief thought on that. We have roughly 15 minutes left, and I know there are many other questions. And in fact, I should have directed that question to somebody. Ben, would you like to give a very short response to that? It can be your thoughts, please.
And it can be positive. Yeah, sure. I think definitely reformers can emerge. There are people we know very high up in the current political system in Russia who at the moment are working within the system and so in a sense are compromised, and yet they don't agree with everything that's taking place. The problem is at the moment that they can't be vocal about that because of the change in the nature of the regime, as Ilya mentioned. But, generational change is inevitable. And so I think we can't discount the possibility that these younger generations, when they rise up, that a reformer could easily emerge. I don't see anything necessary that would stop that from happening.
Yeah, I think thanks for your response there, Ben. I think this is a slightly positive track that we found ourselves on, and I want to utilize. I want to bring it for all it's worth. Just while we're on it. We interviewed Mikhail Lobanov, who's a Democratic Socialist candidate, who's been running in Moscow and who, in fact, this evening has been protesting in Moscow over the results, particularly electronic voting, which he believes has been falsified against him. He's planning a court campaign to try and defend the results. And he's waged this kind of grassroots, self-organized campaign in the city, kind of contesting the sort of past 10 years of renovation, remodeling, and kind of development, and trying to bring out the kind of potential for self-organization and kind of community-led politics. Ilya, I know you are kind of close to that campaign and a supporter of that. I wonder if you might say a few words about what that campaign's been up to. And for our readers, listeners, viewers in the chat, we have an interview with Mikhail Lobanov available there in case you wish to read it. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to say that this was an exceptional campaign, and I think we will fully understand how exceptional it was only in the coming days and maybe in the coming months, because truly it was something that Russia has not seen in the last 30 years. So Lobanov calls himself a democratic socialist quite explicitly. So this is how he calls himself, not just in open democracy interviews in English, but in his campaigning, in his actual campaigning in Moscow. So what is democratic socialism for Russia? So it's not old style communist party, sort of conservative leftism, right? Connected with nostalgia for the Soviet Union, but it's also not the liberalism that dominated Russian opposition for a long time. So it's a new thing. And this new thing is in terms of electoral campaigns, it's not, of course, it's not unique. We know politicians who have broadly similar views, like Oleg Shein, for instance. But at the same time, in Moscow, in this particular campaign, this was a unique ideological message. And not only was it successful, just broadly speaking, but we need to understand that Mikhail Lobanov had the biggest vote out of all the candidates who took part in this election in single-member districts in Moscow. So if we do not count electronic voting, which was fraudulent from start to finish, if we only count the real voting, then Mikhail Lobanov got the biggest vote out of every candidate, including United Russia candidates. So this is something to comprehend, that his campaign was actually the most successful campaign in Moscow. And I have a suspicion that it was the most successful campaign in the whole Russia in terms of single member district campaigns for this Duma election, right? So this finally shows us that the hope that we as leftists and as democratic socialists had in Russia, such as me, for instance, I also identify as democratic socialist. So this hope that a combination of democratic demands and social demands and a combination of grassroots activism and a very smart and very committed, determined electoral strategy. So this combination can actually bring results. Not only did it bring results, it actually brought the best results in this particular election. So this is something to comprehend. And I think that despite the fact that officially Lobanov lost, we still have the biggest win that the left had in Russia for years. In this campaign, we have the biggest win that the left-wing, part of Russian political spectrum had in years. And this is definitely not the end, because Misha is fighting for the results of the election, and he's one of the most active candidates who do this. And also the coalition that he created. So this group of people that unites people with completely different backgrounds and people with different ideological views, this coalition is going nowhere. So it stays, and this will be the platform to develop this kind of politics into the future. So in that sense, I'm extremely optimistic, because a lot of observers were skeptical about this campaign. They said, no, this cannot work. This is just some unknown guy. He is just nobody. He has no media presence. He's a socialist. Who needs socialists within opposition landscape in Russia? So everyone votes for Yabloko, and they say that Bolshevism is, this totalitarian terror. So who needs guys like this? And apparently, Mikhail proved them all wrong. So
yeah, could you say? Sorry, could you just say a word about what the campaign actually did? What kind of issues in Moscow it was bringing up? Just very briefly, sort of 45 seconds, if we could have that on that. And please, listeners, viewers in the chat, if you have any more questions, please go ahead. This is the last sort of 10 minutes of this event, so we would love to have some more questions.
Right. So very briefly, it was a combination of local issues, such as defending green spaces, defending parks, also activism at the university, because Mikhail is a professor at Moscow State University, and within this demands for the release of political prisoners, for political freedoms in Russia. And also it was social demands, such as raising the minimum wage. And he proposed to raise the minimum wage in Moscow to 45,000 rubles, which would be a very, very substantial increase. So it's a combination of local issues, social demands, and democratic demands that unite basically all the members of the opposition.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ilya. We have a couple of questions on Alexei Navalny. So I wonder if we might address these, because I know that our viewers want to hear your thoughts. Let's go with the slightly more depressing one first, which is Nelson Mandela survived prison in apartheid South Africa. Do you think Navalny will survive prison in Russia, and are there any key similarities or differences?
So that's the question: are the authorities going to kill Navalny in prison? Of course, yeah. With two social scientists, we're going to say we don't predict. That's not what we do. We should also note that lots of people didn't foresee the fact that Navalny would be poisoned when he was. They thought he's too big to fail. The authorities are going to find other ways to deal with him. So to a certain extent, we're limited in what we can predict. What I would say, though, at the moment, it seems to be in an equilibrium. Navalny is out of sight, in prison, limited contact to the outside world. Not no contact. There are ways in which he can get messages out, including through his lawyers, to give interviews to the New York Times, to place op-eds in The Guardian. But with the prospect that he's going to be in prison for multiple years, there are new charges against him that could keep him in prison even longer. I think that's fine. The authorities can keep him alive, spare international outrage at him dying in prison, and yet stopping him from being a meaningful political force and being visible to a significant proportion of Russian society. So, I mean, that's my prediction of sorts.
Thank you. That's great. I wonder actually if we might just move, not to deprive you of the opportunity to answer that question, but if we might move to another Navalny-related question, which I think is important, which is probably again to Ben, but I think Ilya, you might want to come in on this as well, which is, could you please briefly describe the current ideological positioning of Navalny and maybe how it shifted from its previous positions? And I wonder if, kind of brief responses on that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I could do a really brief one, and then maybe Ilya can give the more interesting one. I wanted to chip in fact, when Ilya was talking about Mikhail Lobanov's position, because Navalny, in the 1990s, and this is a story that we tell in the book, called himself a market fundamentalist. He was cheering the changes that Yeltsin brought on, and he was not a friend of the left. But his position has evolved over time. He is a politician who is conscious of wanting to build as broad a coalition as possible, and it's interesting that for his attempted run in the 2018 presidential election, we saw much more left-wing detail on his platform. And so it's fascinating that, what Ilya was saying about Lobanov, you could bar the sort of specific issues relating to Moscow, but, Navalny's platform ended up being quite similar in that regard. But I imagine that Ilya will be able to say more on that. More broadly, Navalny is calling for the toppling of the current regime, for a rule of law state, for democracy. We tried to say that, if we lifted Navalny and plonked him into a Western European context, people might refer to him as a centre-right candidate. But that's tricky because of these, the left-wing elements for his 2018 run. So it's complicated, but I don't think we should overblow that complication. You can try and make sense of Navalny using the usual concepts and tools that we would in other contexts. But let me hand over to Ilya.
Right. So I think that we need to reverse our roles a little bit with Ben, because on this one, I am pessimistic, actually. I don't really believe that Navalny turned into a leftist or something like this. So I think at the core, he's still a right-of-center politician, you could say. So he's like a liberal with certain conservative kind of views. And his approach to social demands was very instrumental. So it's not like he truly believes in them, in my opinion, apart from a certain, populism, like genuine populism. So he feels for the Russian people, therefore he wants Russians to live better, therefore he wants better healthcare, better education. And so in this, he's not idolizing the market now, right? He's more like he's feeling for the people. On this level, yes, there is something to the fact that he's moving to the left. But at the same time, he's surrounded by extremely right-wing guys. This is very important to understand, that he's surrounded by right-wing neoliberal experts, and they're always whispering in his ear that we need to privatize everything, we need to deregulate everything, and the success of the Russian economy after this democratic transition depends on very tough reforms, almost like a repetition of the 90s. And Navalny really does not counter this. And to me, it just shows that there is some kind of populist streak in him, but also there is a sort of right-wing kind of nucleus to his politics. And in that sense, for instance, Mikhail Lobanov has always been like that. He's always been a social democratic, like democratic socialist person. And this is a very deeply ingrained sensibility. And for Navalny, it's not like this. It's not deeply ingrained. I think he's very right-wing, ultimately. But at the same time, I still appreciate a lot his criticism of the oligarchs, his investigations into some big businessmen, not just politicians. And also sometimes he says that they pay very low wages. So he's not only focusing on corruption, he also mentions like wages, he mentions exploitation even. So, but still, like, I think that if Navalny ever comes to power, we need to mobilize all the power that we have on the left of the political spectrum in order to oppose a series of neoliberal reforms that I'm sure are coming in this particular scenario, right? So there's going to be a very strong opposition.
I was just going to say, yes, Ilya, I agree with what you just said, and I wanted to clarify. I wasn't claiming that I thought Navalny was a democratic socialist. What I was saying is that maybe he could be as I say, a centre-right figure who realizes that in order to try and get more votes, he sort of courts this more left-wing agenda because he realized that it's more popular. But on that point, you mentioning that if Navalny were to become president of Russia, although it seems like such a distant possibility now, that's politics for later. At the moment, Navalny has been saying saying, you can join my movement even if you disagree with me ideologically, because we've got a stage one of the battle is to bring down the current system. Then after that, feel free, set up your own parties, disagree with me vehemently, call out, the things that I've said in the past that you disagree with, that you might think are racist, very much so. But at the moment, the stage one and stage two of the battle are important to keep separate, I think, for when thinking about the types of people who support it, and the fact that people will go out on the street at the beginning of this year, even though they don't agree with him personally, ideologically, they just think he was the best positioned person to take down the current system.
Yes, with that, I definitely agree.
That's great. Thanks so much, Ben. So I wonder if we might end more or less on time with our event this evening, but with some final remarks from our participants. And unfortunately, I've actually just I've failed somewhat to formulate a much better question than this. But ultimately, you'll find the answer that you want to give, which is what's next over these next kind of couple of weeks. We see, for example, some of the candidates potentially going to contest the election results via the courts. Very interested to see what will happen with that. We also see some attempts to bring kind of revitalize the protests around the election results. Again, we'll see what happens with that. And then obviously we have legislative initiatives from United Russia to enjoy over the next couple of years. So just a few final remarks on the basis of our conversation from each of our participants would be fantastic, just to round off.
Right. So like I said, I'm not that pessimistic. I think that especially in the capitals, there was such a strong protest vote that it will be expressed in some kind of new organizations, new alliances, new types of activism, and those leaders that emerged in this movement, they were candidates in this election. So now they emerged as leaders in a political movement, and this political movement will stay on. In that sense, I actually think that there is some future, but at the same time, of course, there's no going to be some kind of radical change anytime soon, obviously. But still, there's going to be, it's a struggle. So what can I say? It's a struggle, and we do what we can do in this situation.
Yeah, I'm conscious, Tom, that I don't want to end this in a bleak note. I've seen in the chat people already saying it's quite bleak, even though they appreciate it. And that's good. So I'll finish by saying what I'm going to be focusing on, and that's what's going to happen with the Communist Party, KPRF. So we know that there is a tension between the old guard, Moscow-centric, Zyuganov et al., and the people in the region, the younger lot who are activists who are more radical, some of whom have connections to Navalny's movement. And going forward, I'm fascinated to see how that tension within the party is going to be negotiated. I'm also really interested to see how the presidential administration is going to try and deal with the Communist Party, whether we see them being offered important chairmanships in the Duma to co-opt them, to say, look, you have this is some type of carrot, now make sure that you don't use your performance in these elections to get above your station and be more autonomously oppositional, or whether we see some type of repressive methods being used against the party. So I think going forward, the story that I'm going to be focusing on is what happens to the KPRF, and it's not necessarily a bleak one. There are elements there that could be positive.
I see Ilya has a final, surprisingly enough, because we've mentioned KPRF, which is the Communist Party.
Yeah, exactly. Just a very, very short remark. So when I studied at the university, there was a guy, couple years my senior. He was already a member of the Communist Party, and in the subsequent years, he climbed the ranks, and eventually he became a member of parliament. So his name is Denis Parfenov, and in fact, I never thought much about him because he seemed like a careerist. But now I see that he is actually trying to help this emerging sort of protest movement in Moscow in very meaningful ways. And to me, this just represents the fact that the Communist Party is not all lost, because he did not infiltrate the Communist Party, from the outside. He has always been a member of the Communist Party. So I know him for like 15 years. He's always been a member. So since he was 18 or something. And so and now he's actually doing the work. So this is also the source of optimism for me. So
thank you, Ilya, for another optimistic note to end on. I want to thank our participants for joining us tonight, Dr. Ben Noble and Dr. Ilya Matveev. I just want to point out again that Ben has a book out about Alexei Navalny, which is called Navalny, Putin's Nemesis, Russia's Future. Please check it out. I also want to invite our audience, if you're not currently signed up to our newsletter, please do so. It's pretty easy. You just have to go on the website. And in fact, there's a link in the chat. We also have Facebook and Twitter accounts for our Russia-related coverage, which are also in the chat. And I also want to invite you to sign up for our live event next week, which hopefully there will be a link in the chat because I don't have it in front of me. And finally, please stay with us. We'll be doing some more coverage on these events over the next couple of weeks, and I think we'll bring out some pretty exciting analysis. Also, do pay attention, of course, to Ben and Ilya. They are some of the best on these issues. So thanks very much, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Also,
Thanks,
donate.
Tom.
There is a link to donate.